What's up everyone, it's your boy Marcus here, back at it again with another video. I was going to jump onto the bandwagon and make a video about Ben Shapiro's BBC interview, but right as I was about to start making it, PragerU released this video. Why don't you support Israel? So I decided I'd respond to the claims made in it. Let's take a look.
When I was the Prime Minister of Canada, I was often asked this question: why do you support Israel? My response, in effect, was always the same: why wouldn't I support Israel?
As with most PragerU videos, this one will simplify a complex, layered issue into a black or white, good versus evil debate. Laughably, the narrator, Canada's former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, will argue that the only reason leftists don't support Israel is because of anti-Semitism. I want to make this clear before going any further in this video. I don't support the policies of the Israeli state in regards to the West Bank and Gaza, but that doesn't mean I am against the nation as a whole. It is possible to support the existence of a nation while vehemently disagreeing with what it's doing. Of course, I support Israel's right to exist, but this isn't even a necessary thing for anyone to say, because that existence is presently under absolutely no threat. That's why this is a response video and not a debunking, because I'm not going to prove to you why you shouldn't support Israel. Rather, I'm going to dispute the claims made by Harper in this video. Framing this argument as one of, do you support Israel or do you not, allows those at PragerU to have an upper hand in this discussion. Once someone on the left engages in the right to exist debate, they have already allowed dishonest actors to control the argument. If someone asks me this, I state, of course I believe in Israel's right to exist, but then describe how this argument enables anyone who is not 100% in support of the Israeli state and is critical of its policies towards Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza to be labeled as anti-Israeli, someone that doesn't support Israel's right to exist, and ultimately an anti-Semite. Because many leftists allow the argument to be framed in this manner, they are straw-manned into being people that quote-unquote don't support Israel. PragerU really are an honest bunch. Do you support Israel? It's a similar question to that in the US during the height of the Iraq War. Do you support the troops? Of course I want the troops to remain healthy, alive, and arrive home safe, but I don't support the US military invading and occupying a sovereign nation that posed no threat. It is a question that you can't disagree with without being labeled as an anti-American military hater. Of course I support the troops, but I don't support them in their mission of successfully invading the sovereign nation of Iraq. This is the same with do you support Israel? This type of rhetoric is what has poisoned this debate within the United States. It is classic PragerU, taking a complex issue and boiling it down to a simple, loaded question.
Why wouldn't I support a fellow democratic nation where open elections, free speech, and religious tolerance are the everyday norm? Why wouldn't I support a country with a vibrant free press and an independent judiciary? Why wouldn't I support a valuable trading partner and a wellspring of amazing technological innovation? Why wouldn't I support our most critical ally in the Middle East and in the international struggle against terrorism?
The US never supports a nation or group of people because they simply believe it is the right thing to do, especially when that support is as strong and unbreakable as the support of Israel is. And trust me, if the US foreign policy establishment didn't support Israel so vehemently, PragerU wouldn't be telling you to support it either. They love the neocons in Washington. Every move that is taken in foreign policy by the US must align with and benefit its interests. For example, the US didn't become involved in the Serbia-Kosovo conflict because it genuinely cared about Albanians and Bosnians being ethnically cleansed. No, the US had something to gain by ensuring that the Kosovo region be governed by a pro-Western regime and not Serbia, a nation who has a strong alliance with Russia. Of course, stopping the genocide of Muslim Albanians by Milosevic was the correct decision. It gave the US a reason to become involved in the conflict, a conflict which resulted in it gaining much more influence within the Balkans and the lands surrounding Russia's border. On the flip side, the US will actively ignore and deny genocides when if intervening would harm its interests. Saudi Arabia's genocide of Yemenis is a prime example. Here are some facts about this conflict. Mint Press News reports, quote, Saudi Arabia imposed its blockade over Yemen shortly after revolutionary forces took control of the country's capital, Sana'a, in 2015. This land, air, and sea blockade severely restricts imports, exports, and the flow of movement, unquote. They continue, quote, this embargo, combined with a shortage of medical and sanitation equipment, eventually triggered a cholera epidemic. From April 2017 until the end of the year, over 1 million people became infected with this very preventable, very treatable, and very fatal disease. Thousands died because they were not able to receive medical care in time, unquote. Over the past 3+ years, US-backed Saudi airstrikes have produced over 35,000 civilian casualties, over 13,000 killed, and over 21,000 injured, many of which are women and children, unquote. This is an active genocide being sponsored by the US. It is done so because it benefits US interests within the Middle East. But you might be asking yourself, why am I talking about this in response to Stephen Harper describing the uniquely democratic aspects of the Israeli state compared to its neighbors? Because it is important to understand that the US supports Israel for two main reasons. The first is the incredible power of the pro-Israeli lobby within US politics. We saw it flex its muscles when Ilhan Omar dared to criticize the policies of Israel. Not the Israeli people, not the Jewish religion, but the policies of Israel. The second is that supporting Israel with $50 billion annually aligns with US interests within the Middle East. The US is on the side of Middle Eastern nations that are enemies of Iran. Israel, along with Saudi Arabia, share this same adversary. So Israel, a nation that has proven itself to be incredibly strong militarily, makes for an incredibly valuable ally in this Middle Eastern Cold War. This support doesn't come because Israel has open elections, free speech, and practices religious tolerance. No, it's because Israel is incredibly pro-Western, openly trades with the US, and its interests within the Middle East align with that of the US's. Both of these reasons are why PragerU made this video. And of course it will use free speech as a reason for why you and I should support Israel. On the other hand, though, it has never called out President Trump for his strengthening of ties with Saudi Arabia, a nation that actively suppresses speech. That is because PragerU agrees with the US support of Saudi Arabia, but knows that openly stating so wouldn't be popular. The US provides military support to 36 of the world's 49 nations governed by a dictatorship. That is 73% of the world's non-democratic nations. The US doesn't care if its allies practice free speech or not, and neither does PragerU. And even though Israel is a nation that ranks higher in press freedom than its Middle Eastern neighbors, that's no excuse for any of its actions within the West Bank and Gaza. But more on that later. The final point I want to make before continuing on is this map that Stephen Harper alludes to. It can seem quite convincing, right? Israel needs your unwavering support because it could be annihilated at any moment. If you don't support it completely, you're obviously anti-Semitic because you are okay with the destruction of the Jewish state by its barbaric, undemocratic neighbors. What PragerU doesn't mention is that Jordan and Egypt, two of the 4 nations that border it, are major non-NATO allies of the US, while Saudi Arabia, the most powerful Arab nation, is a major ally of the US. This map while attempting to call those that question Israel anti-Semitic, is in fact highly Islamophobic. First, it assumes that every Middle Eastern state outside of Israel is actively seeking to annihilate it and destroy it. This is a lie. Israel currently holds strong peace treaties with Jordan and Egypt, and in addition, the country is cultivating a strong alliance with Saudi Arabia. All three of these nations, in addition to Israel, share the same strong allegiance with the United States. And let's remember, Saudi Arabia and Iran are eternal enemies, and the U.S. is close allies with both Saudi Arabia and Israel. These two nations might not be friends, but they are surely not enemies. Israel's relationships with Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan are also getting stronger. These nations are not seeking to destroy Israel. They want to team up with it to counter Iran, which brings up the second reason this map is complete bullshit. It assumes in a very Islamophobic way that all Muslim-majority countries are somehow unified because they're Muslims, when anyone who knows a single thing about the Middle East understands that this is complete bullshit, right? Iran and Saudi Arabia hate each other. Saudi Arabia presently has major beef with Qatar. There is a hundreds of years old conflict between Sunnis and Shias, which feeds into the Arab-Persian Saudi Arabia-Iran rivalry. To suggest that every other nation in the Middle East is unified against Israel is an incredibly ignorant claim. In an ironic twist, though, this map propaganda was the same tactic used by Nazi Germany and other anti-Semitic fascists in the early 20th century to fearmonger about the Jewish-controlled communist Soviet Union. Just look at the tiny Germany in the top left corner of this map, guys. I mean, oh my god. And then look at how big the communist Jews are. We need to do something about this and 100% support Germany. The map PragerU is using does the same thing, but this time it switches out the communist Jews part for barbaric Muslims. This type of victimization legitimizes notions such as, hey man, we have to profile Arabs and Palestinians, you know? And, hey man, Israel might just have to preemptively annex the West Bank and Gaza for its own safety.
In a rational world, in a world where simple common sense prevailed, the question, why do you support Israel, would be like asking, why do you support Australia or Canada? But we don't live in that rational common sense world. So the case for Israel has to be made over and over. I, for one, am happy to make it.
PragerU are experts at strawmanning the left and simplifying such a complicated subject. I don't even want to engage in the do you support Israel or not debate, and now I have to have it about Canada? Come on, man. This is comparing apples to oranges. The support of Israel by the US is clearly different than that of Australia and Canada. In the US, politicians can criticize policies implemented by the governments of these nations without being smeared as anti-Canadian or anti-Australian. In fact, they do it quite a lot when it comes to universal health care or immigration. There is no Canadian or Australian version of AIPAC or even a pro-Canadian or Australian lobby within US politics. This is not a real argument. Canada and Australia have not violated international law by expanding their borders through military force. Whether you agree with Israeli policies towards the West Bank and Gaza or not, it is a fact that after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Israel increased its share of the UN 1947 partition plan. Then in 1967, through the Six-Day War, Israel acquired control of the Golan Heights, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Sinai Peninsula. Canada and Australia, although the land was acquired unethically and immorally from indigenous peoples through military conquest, haven't recently violated international law like Israel has, and the conflict between indigenous Australians and Australians of European descent is not constantly erupting in violence, with both sides committing atrocities and war crimes. Again, it's comparing apples to oranges. While the treatment of Canadian and Australian indigenous peoples has been and is currently wrong and should be subject to criticism, it is a completely different situation than that of the West Bank and Gaza, and requires the U.S. to treat the actions of Israel differently than those of Canada. Come on, man. I can't believe I really have to say this. This statement by Harper, though, is a classic example of deflection. It reminds me of some classics, such as, I don't support Israel occupying and blockading the Gaza Strip. Hey man, I mean, you say these, and you always criticize Israel, but I never hear you criticize Saudi Arabia. And of course, there's this famous Jill Stein Fox News interview.
My question to you is, do you think Israel is more an outlaw state than, say, Cuba is? Which is a more legitimate government?
Well, let me say this. Our policy applies to all countries,
right.
And that is where there are flagrant violations of human rights, war crimes, assassinations, and international law, then we need to stop supporting those countries, to stop funding them. So we're calling for a level playing field here. Everything we say about Israel also applies to our ally Saudi Arabia, for example, or to Egypt. In the case of Israel, we are providing $8 million a day for an army, which is an army of occupation, which is in defiance of international law. So this isn't something that just I am making up. This is the actual statements of the United Nations and international law.
But are you making a moral equivalence between Israel and Cuba, where there are gulags and jailing of dissidents? I mean, are you making that moral equation?
Well, we're not funding Cuba to the tune of $8 million a day.
That's too good. That's a brilliant Tucker Carlson question.
Let me start with this. Every military action Israel has ever taken has been to protect itself. Israel is not an aggressor state. It's a defensive state. This has been true from its founding to this day. As a fledgling nation in 1948, Israel was immediately attacked by its Arab neighbors. Their goal was not to contain the tiny new country. It was to annihilate it. No nation came to Israel's aid. Not the United States, not my country, Canada, not the United Kingdom. No one. They all thought Israel would lose, but it didn't lose. It won. In 1967, Israel's neighbors again sought to utterly destroy the Jewish state, a nation that had then existed for 2 decades. Again, Israel prevailed, and it survived another all-out attack in 1973. Those are the big wars, but I'm not sure there's been a single day in Israel's entire history when some act of terror has not been waged against it, inside or outside its borders. There have been 2 bloody waves of terror, so-called intifadas, in the late 1980s and the early 2000s, when Israelis were blown up on buses, at pizza parlors, and celebrating weddings. There have been incursions from terror groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon. There have been thousands of rocket attacks from Hamas in the Gaza Strip, even after Israel completely withdrew from that territory in 2005.
Okay, there is a lot to talk about here, and this is the part that made me really want to make a response video. As stated before, this is a complex issue, and simply stating that every Israeli military action has been defensive is far too simple of an answer, and also completely wrong. But again, this is more of a response and not a debunking, because Harper wasn't totally wrong here, but it's what he leaves out, especially that who started these wars is still up for legitimate debate, that makes this a propaganda video. The same is true for Harper's simple explanations of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, also known as Israel's War of Independence, the Six-Day War in 1967, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, and the many terrorist attacks carried out by Arab Palestinians against Israeli Jews. I'm going to talk about these conflicts, the offensive Israeli military conflicts that Harper conveniently leaves out, and importantly, the creation of the Israeli state needs to be discussed to provide context, something that PragerU doesn't seem to like. The BBC provides a great timeline of the creation of Israel and its multiple conflicts. In addition, I would suggest that everyone read Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn by Daniel Gordis, who is not anti-Israeli by any stretch of the imagination. He's actually quite the opposite. The best place to start with this history is 1917, when the British took control of Palestine from the failing Ottoman Empire. European Jews had already begun immigrating to the Palestinian territory in the mid-19th century as the Zionist movement began growing, taking the Jewish population from a small minority of 7,000 in 1880 to 43,000 in 1860 and up to 94,000 in 1914. Arabs remained the majority by more than 75% in 1914, but there was constant violence between the two groups, with violent militias forming on both sides. The militias on the Jewish side were Zionist groups, believing the Jewish people deserved a peace granted by God in the Torah of Palestine to be their own state. The Arab militias believed that the mass migration of European Jews was a form of colonialism and ethnic cleansing. They believed that Arabs, making up more than 75% of the population, should have a unified Palestinian state independent of the British. These two ideologies were in direct conflict with one another. In 1917, the same year Britain took control of the Palestinian territory, the Crown released the Balfour Declaration. It read, quote, "His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people," unquote. Britain then had the Palestinian Mandate officially granted to it by the League of Nations in 1920. The Jews in Palestine were now on the side of the British. Arab Palestinian nationalists, angry at both the British occupation of Palestine, the continued mass immigration of European Jews into Palestine, the Balfour Declaration, and the Peel Commission, which created the proposed borders of the Jewish state, began a violent revolt against both the British and the Jews, known as the 1936-1939 Arab Revolt in Palestine. David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Israel and one of the more famous Zionists, understood why the Arabs began this uprising, stating it was, quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, out of fear of growing Jewish economic power and opposition to mass Jewish immigration, unquote. And in many ways, the Arab fears were well founded. In the 1930s, the Jewish population in Palestine increased from 94,000 in 1914 to 175,000 in 1931. While the revolt failed, the British knew that they had to do something to quell the anger of the Arabs and therefore attempted to limit the migration of Jews to the region. The White Paper was ratified by Britain in 1939, limiting Jewish immigration to 75,000 for 5 years, while it restated the British support for a Jewish state to be created within the Palestinian Mandate. After the 5 years, immigration would be controlled by the majority Arab population. You know, I find it very funny and interesting that no right-winger or PragerU type ever brings this up when discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's almost as if they, only care about immigration and refugees if it's non-white people. But in this case, they're all for it. Soon after, however, the White Paper was completely thrown out, and rightly so, due to the persecution of Jews in Europe and the subsequent Holocaust. Illegal immigration by Jewish refugees greatly increased, while in 1943, already far too late, the British allowed any, quote, Jewish refugee who reached a neutral country in transit to be given clearance for Palestine, unquote. Because of this, the Jewish population in the area exploded from 175,000 in 1931 to 630,000 in 1947. Jews went from being 17% of Palestine to 32%. If those at PragerU, right, and all these right-wingers were Palestinian, do you think they would have welcomed Jewish refugees en masse with open arms? You can answer that yourself. Because of the White Paper, however, many in the Jewish community felt betrayed by the British. The two had fought together against the Arabs to quell the uprising, and the British supposedly supported a Jewish state, but the White Paper was a slap in the face, and was the cause of many European Jews being killed in concentration camps. Zionist militias such as the Irgun and Lay carried out terrorist attacks against Palestinian Arabs and the British in response. There was even a plan by the Irgun and other militias to completely overthrow the British rule of Palestine. It was a bloody and violent mess, but one where the Arabs could make a fair argument that Zionists were immigrating en masse to Palestine and purchasing land with the intent of removing Arabs from a place they'd lived for hundreds of years. On the other hand, we can all clearly see the need for a Jewish state due to the centuries of Jewish persecution throughout the Arab and European worlds. This is the lead-up to the partition plan in the 1948 war that Stephen Harper confidently states was purely defensive by the Israelis and 100% offensive by the Arabs. PragerU leaves out this context because it makes the situation much more blurry, as the conflict is anything but black and white. I personally support a Jewish state existing within the region, but also understand the anger of Arabs not wanting Jewish immigration at a mass scale that would eventually make them the minority on their own land. And you'd think PragerU would understand this as well. As you can tell, I struggle to 100% commit to one of these sides, showcasing just how complicated this conflict really is. After World War II, the newly created United Nations voted on a partition plan of the British Mandate. This was viewed as a viable solution to the constant violence between Arabs and Jews. The borders were drawn so that the Jews would be a 55% majority within their Jewish state, and Arabs would be a 99% majority with their Palestinian state. However, when looking at the entire territory of the Mandate, Arabs remained the clear majority at 67%, even if it was the lowest it had been in centuries. Because of this clear majority within the British Mandate as a whole, all of the Arab states and a few other nations, including Greece, Turkey, Egypt, and Cuba, voted against the partition plan, arguing that it coerced the majority within the region. The Arab nations wanted a unified Palestinian state because they felt the safety of Arabs living as a minority within the Jewish state would be under threat. They argued Jews living in the state would be protected. But honestly, you can understand why the Jews had their well-founded doubts about that, and I would as well. Although the Arab nations vehemently opposed the partition plan, the General Assembly approved it on November 29th, 1947, with a vote of 33 for, 13 against, and 10 abstaining. Unfortunately, Arab fears of violence against Arabs within the Jewish region were confirmed, because on April 9th, 1948, just a few months after the vote, two Jewish militias, the Irgun and Lay, carried out the Deir Yassin massacre. 107 Arabic civilians were killed that night, with many of the women being raped, while the village Deir Yassin was completely pillaged and destroyed. Whether you agree with the partition plan or not, there is a valid complaint made by the Arab states that this continued Western meddling within the region was endangering the Arab Palestinian population. Of course, there were atrocities committed by Arabs against the Jewish population as well, making their push for a Jewish state also completely and 100% warranted. These included the Hadassah Medical Convoy Massacre, where 78 Jewish doctors, nurses, students, and patients were killed by Arab forces, and the Kfar Etzion Massacre, where 129 Jewish soldiers and civilians were summarily executed by Arab forces. These atrocities committed by both sides make this anything but a simple topic or easy decision, as PragerU would have you believe. The fight got to a point where no one knows who started aggressions, but revenge must always be taken. Harper doesn't bring up any of this. Either way, this brings us to the first conflict he discusses, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, also known by many as Israel's War of Independence. I hope I've provided enough context here. It's quite long, I know. That is the problem with responding to videos like this, right? There are so many lies of omission, blatant lies, and simplifications that it's strenuous to even think of how to respond to Harper's video. But let's continue on. The conflict unofficially began on November 30th, 1947, the day after the partition plan was approved and the Arab League unanimously and subsequently rejected it. However, the war officially began on May 15th, 1948, when the Yishuv People's Assembly under David Ben-Gurion's leadership approved Israel's declaration of independence from the British Mandate, establishing a Jewish nation in accordance with the UN partition plan. Just hours after this, the British Mandate was dissolved, and just hours after this, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt declared war and invaded the newly founded country. Their reasoning was to protect Arabs that would be a minority within the newly created state, stop the independence, maintain law and order that had left with the British, and fight for a unified, independent Palestinian state. This is some of the Arab League's statement to the UN on why, and think of how similar it actually sounds to a right-wing PragerU fan talking about modern-day immigration into the First World. Quote, Great Britain, however, placed Palestine in such a position as made it possible for the Jews to flood the country with waves of immigrants and factually help their establishment on the soil despite the saturation of the land with its population, which did exceed the absorptive capacity of the country economically and otherwise, thereby neglecting the provided-for interests and the rights of its lawful inhabitants. The Arabs used all means at all times to express their deep concern and anxiety at such a policy which they felt was undermining their future and their very existence. But at all such times they were met with utter disregard and harsh treatment such as jail, exile, etc. The apprehensions of the Arab states proved to be well-founded, as the disturbances of which they had warranted soon swept the country, and armed conflict took place between its two peoples, who started to combat against each other and shed each other's blood. Consequently, the UN realized the mistake upon which the recommendation of partition was made and turned to search for an outlet. Now that the mandate over Palestine has come to an end, leaving no legally constituted authority behind in order to administer law and order in the country and afford the necessary and adequate protection to life and property, unquote. And now I'm paraphrasing, they state, we are declaring war on the newly founded Israeli state. A legitimate argument can be made here that the war of 1948 was, yes, to destroy Israel and a complete aggression by the Arab states, but the more proper term would be it was a war to stop a secession. They believed Palestine should be a unified Arab-controlled state, and Israel wanted to secede from this newly found nation. Just as the Union stopped the Confederacy from seceding with military force, and Great Britain tried to stop the 13 colonies from becoming independent. But no one describes these events as Great Britain wanting to annihilate and commit a genocide against the 13 colonies. I'm sure those at PragerU would support Spain's military invading Catalonia if it officially declared independence, and I'm sure Harper would be okay with Canada invading French Canada if they also declared independence. Arab nations also had genuine fears that extremist militias such as the Irgun would continue to terrorize and kill Arabs once the British had left, and that there was no law and order to stop this massacre. This conflict, this war, one that Israel won decisively, gained much more territory from it, and it is not a certain defensive military action taken by the Israelis. One could argue that such a declaration of independence, with no talks to create an independent state, was itself an aggressive action. This is a debate to be had. In addition, during this conflict, the BBC reports, quote, 750,000 Palestinian Arabs either fled or were expelled from the Jewish state, unquote. 60% of the Arabic population were removed from Israeli-controlled land. That was an active process by the Zionists to ethnically cleanse the region of Arabs. There is a list of about 400 Arabic towns in the newly created Jewish state that were quote-unquote depopulated during this conflict, either being completely destroyed or repopulated by Jews and then renamed. Even if you believe that this was a clearly defensive war by the Israelis, that is an objectively fucked up thing to do. In addition, during the war, an IDF commando consisting mainly of former Irgun and lay militia members massacred an estimated 145 Arabic civilians in what is known as the Dawayima massacre. It wasn't the angel Israelis versus the evil genocidal Arabs, as PragerU would have you believe, but a conflict where there are good and bad actors on both sides. There is no way Stephen Harper truly knows this history, because if he did, he wouldn't boil down this multi-layered conflict as one of complete Arab aggression and Israeli defense. Now let's discuss the Six-Day War of 1967, the second conflict that Harper brings up, which was a 100% defensive move by the perfect, never-does-anything-bad Israel. But first, unlike PragerU, a bit of context has to be provided. Again, I mean, it just has to be done, right? But it won't be nearly as long as the 1948 conflict's context. After Israel won its War of Independence in 1949, no independent Arab state was ever established, and this infuriated Arabs across the region, many of whom wanted Jordan, Egypt, and others to attempt another invasion. Many Jews claim that if the Arabs had worked with them to establish Israel, an Arab state would already have been created. But in that climate, and the one to follow, working together was not a realistic option from either side. The Arab states therefore refused to recognize Israel. Subsequently, an arms race began, but an economic war between Israel and its Arab neighbors began as well. Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's leader, realized he could inflict quite a lot of pain on Israel's economy by closing certain shipping routes, such as the Straits of Tiran and the Suez Canal, to Israeli shipping. The Soviet Union and other Warsaw Pact nations supported Egypt via arms sales, creating what Gordis states as, quote, a new military Goliath in the Middle East, and altered the region's balance of power, unquote. In Cold War fashion, the U.S. responded by eliminating all support and arms sales to Egypt. Nasser then made the ballsy decision to nationalize the Suez Canal, forcibly removing it from the hands of the Suez Canal Company and freezing all of the company's assets. The British and the French were incredibly mad, as European military and commercial vessels used the canal daily. Nasser now made Egypt a powerful player, placing the interests of Britain under threat, and according to some, putting Israel under threat because its economy could have theoretically collapsed, as most of its oil came through the Straits of Tiran, while the Suez Canal was vital to its European trade. Therefore, Britain, France, and Israel together decided to invade Egypt in 1956 in what is known as the Second Arab-Israeli War, or the Suez Crisis, with the plan being to take control of the canal and remove Nasser from power. You know, guys, it's truly unacceptable that Egypt be able to control a canal within their own borders. I can't believe this. Ah, my goodness. The attack was successful, but the U.S. demanded that they leave to avoid instigating a larger conflict with the Soviet Union, a demand they adhered to. Again, I mean, Harper conveniently leaves out this blatantly offensive attack by the Israelis because it doesn't fit their agenda. This is nothing more than a clear lie of omission by a clearly dishonest actor. Unfortunately, this invasion only intensified the hate many Arabs had of Israel, supporting the idea that Israel was a continuation of Western encroachment and colonialism into the Arab world. Now, the Six-Day War was another 10 years after this, but it was another 10 years of growing tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors. It was around this time that Yasser Arafat, an Egyptian who had founded Fatah, joined the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, but more on this later. When Israel pulled out of Egypt in 1956, it did so because the U.S. promised that the Straits of Tiran would remain open to Israeli shipping. Israel made it clear that it would consider any closing of these straits by Egypt an act of war. Strangely, as a conflict was brewing in 1967, the Soviet Union gave Egyptian leader Nasser false reports that Israel was mobilizing soldiers on its border with Syria. In response to this false information, Nasser closed the Straits of Iran to Israeli shipping and shortly after signed a defense pact with Jordan. It was at this moment that the hate of Israel by its Arab neighbors was becoming incredibly intense. and Arab extremists began speaking in genocidal terms. They wanted revenge for the mass migration of Jews into Palestine, the UN partition plan, Israel's victory in 1948, Western meddling within the region such as the invasion of Egypt in 1956, and the continued lack of an independent Palestinian state. Quote, "The existence of Israel is an error which must be rectified. This is our opportunity to wipe out this ignominy which has been with us since 1948. Our goal is clear, to wipe Israel off the map. We shall, God willing, meet in Tel Aviv and Haifa," unquote. President Abdel Rahman Aref of Iraq in 1967, just before the war. Although these are harsh words from Iraq's former president, politicians often make such bold statements to fire up their people while having no intention of actually fulfilling them. Israeli leaders did the same, exaggerating the threats posed by its Arab neighbors by taking advantage of such reckless comments, using them to claim that the Arabs were unifying to destroy Israel and carry out a second Holocaust. Even if this wasn't necessarily to be accomplished through military invasion, but through economic attacks such as Nasser closing the Straits of Tiran. Ariel Sharon, a top IDF general at the time, said this in the lead-up to the war: "We have the power to destroy the Egyptian army, but if we give up on the free passage issue, we have opened the door to Israel's destruction. We will have to pay a far higher price in the future for something that we, in any case, had to do now. The people of Israel are ready to wage a just war, to fight, and to pay the price. The question isn't free passage, but the existence of the people of Israel," unquote. Such statements work to victimize Israel, even though it had soundly defeated its Arab neighbors in 1948 and had launched an offensive war against Egypt in 1956. In addition, the Arabs were actually not united at all in the lead-up to the 1967 war. The BBC reports, quote, "Arabs talked a lot about unity, socialism, and nationalism, but in reality, they were deeply disunited. The Syrian and Egyptian leaderships fretted about plots allegedly instigated by the monarchies in Jordan and Saudi Arabia," unquote, while Jordan was untrusted by Egypt because it emerged in that period as a close ally of the US and Britain. The context surrounding this conflict is complicated and still a subject of heated debate to this day. It's funny that Harper can give such confident statements about 48 and 1967, even though it's a 50-50 as to whether Israel's existence was under threat and whether it acted defensively or offensively when it preemptively carried out an airstrike against Egypt's Air Force on June 5th, 1967. This strike destroyed Egypt's Air Force, giving Israel complete air superiority and essentially winning them the war within its first couple of hours. Again, there is a legitimate scholarly debate to be had as to whether it was an offensive or defensive move. Let's start with the defensive argument that PragerU and others, but also many honest actors such as Daniel Gordis, support. It states that the Arab nations, especially Egypt, by controlling the Suez Canal and closing the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, would have destroyed Israel's economy. While Israel was facing a war on three fronts, with Syria invading from the northeast, Jordan from the east, and Egypt from the southwest, Israel had to preemptively strike because its existence was under threat and an invasion was imminent either way. On the flip side, many argue that this preemptive strike was done by Israel to expand its borders and that Egypt wanted to wage an economic war with Israel, not a real one. Michael Orn, an Israeli historian, acknowledged that both, quote, U.S. and Israeli intelligence indicated that troop movements in Egypt, taken by themselves, had only defensive, not offensive purposes, unquote. One could argue that the closing of the Straits of Tiran gave Israel, whose hardliners and religious extremists were itching for a war, all the reason it needed. This reasoning was made easier by claims that Israel's very existence was under threat, with a second Holocaust on the cards. But many disagree with this claim. Quote, Mordechai Bentov, an Israeli cabinet minister, called into question the idea that there was a danger of extermination, saying that it was, quote, invented of whole cloth and exaggerated after the fact to justify the annexation of new Arab territories. Arab states have argued since that it was a clear act of aggression and conquest by Israel, unquote. Israel annexed the Golan Heights, West Bank, Gaza, and Sinai Peninsula from its neighbors during the war. Only since then has it relinquished control of the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt, but it still occupies the West Bank and the Golan Heights while blockading Gaza, all while Arab Palestinians continue to not have an independent state. As with many of these things, I am on the fence with this topic, but agree that Israel's existence was not under threat, but its economy was. Unfortunately, due to the importance of the Suez Canal and the Straits of Tiran, a military conflict between Israel and Egypt seemed imminent, and probably would have happened at some point. The threat posed by the Arab states, however, was exaggerated, as Israel's military embarrassed all three nations in 1948, and even more so in 1967. This in many ways proved that the threat was exaggerated. Either way, this is a conflict where no one side is perfect and the other is evil, as Stephen Harper is making it seem. PragerU is allowing Israel to play the victim card here by making it seem as though Egypt, Jordan, and Syria were hell-bent on a second Holocaust and were the clear aggressors, while leaving out, conveniently, that it was actually Israel that struck first. Again, this is not a simple Israel made a 100% defensive decision here, but rather it is up for legitimate debate. The U.S. wages economic wars on its adversaries all the time, just like Egypt against Israel, but PragerU never comes out and states that the U.S. is an aggressor state and Iranian or Venezuelan retaliation is defensive. It's almost as if PragerU have an agenda, right? Now, back to Arafat and the PLO. While the Israelis decisively won the Six-Day War, it had major repercussions for the future relationship between itself and the Palestinian people and radicalization on both sides. Israel now occupied the West Bank, land that many of the 750,000 Palestinians that had fled during the war in 48 lived on. They were now occupied by the same state that had forced them to flee, fomenting even more anger. This helped the PLO and Palestinian nationalism gain popularity. Gordis writes, quote, "Now, in 1967, with the Palestinians humiliated, the Arafat-led Fatah was suddenly more appealing to millions of Palestinians than it ever had been. Fatah took over the PLO, and Arafat, now an international figure, became its chairman. Yasser Arafat was for all intents and purposes the political leader of the Palestinians," unquote. He continues, quote, "Now it was clear the triumph had also awakened a new conflict with the Palestinians. Both sides reacted to the extraordinary change with ideological passion. On the Israeli side, Gush Emunim emerged, giving new ideological passion to the settlement movement. For the Palestinians, Israel's victory added energy and fuel to their own nationalism and their desire to eradicate the Jewish state," unquote. This was the new war that would be waged. And this is the war Stephen Harper is talking about when he says Israelis are always under threat from terrorist attacks. And he's right, but he paints it as a pure act of aggression by those committing the attacks, which again is right if you look at these attacks within a vacuum. But that's not how this works. There is a cause and an effect to every policy that has been taken. He points to all the apparent aggressive moves by Arabs against Israelis, but doesn't discuss how Israel's ethnic cleansing during the 48 war, its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza since 1967, plus the West Bank settlement movement have resulted in these terrorist attacks. This, of course, is no excuse for these vile attacks against civilians, which actually have the opposite impact that they are intended to. But again, there is no excuse for these attacks, just like U.S. interventionism and offensive wars are no excuse for 9/11. But the policies that the U.S. implemented directly caused these attacks. But any terrorist attack needs to be analyzed with context, with the big picture in mind. And when done so, yes, every attack that has been carried out against Israelis by the Fatah, the PLO, or Hamas is unforgivable. But without the ethnic cleansing of 48, the continued lack of a Palestinian state, and the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza by Israel, many of these attacks might never have happened. Before 67, Yasser Arafat and Fatah were well known, but they were still viewed as extremists, who, while popular, could never be the voice of all Palestinians. The aggressive military actions of Israel during the Suez Crisis and the Six-Day War gave these extremists all they needed to gain control. A similar comparison can be made with the U.S. funding Mujahideen when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. This policy decision, just like Israel's annexation of the West Bank, can be pointed to as a major cause of 9/11. Now, Harper brings up the first and second intifadas after providing no context or discussion of the West Bank and Gaza occupation or the settlement movement. Intifada can be translated from Arabic as a tremor, shivering, or shuddering. The first intifada in the late 1980s marked the first time that Palestinians from all parts of its society rose up against Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. There was no single organized campaign, but of course Hamas and the PLO under Yasser Arafat conducted many acts of violence against both the IDF and Israeli civilians. However, PragerU leaves out the fact that the retaliation by the Israelis to such resistance by the Palestinians in occupied territories was incredibly harsh. In the first intifada, 277 Israelis were killed, compared to 1,962 Palestinians. In the second intifada, around 1,000 Israelis were killed, compared to around 3,000 Palestinians. Again, there is no excuse under any circumstances for the targeting of civilians, but these intifadas are viewed much differently when the conflict as a whole is analyzed. PragerU is tainting an entire movement where many Palestinians involved had legitimate gripes with Israeli policy, and painting all protesters as Hamas or PLO combatants is patently false and leads to more extremism. The final war Harper brought up was the Yom Kippur War of 1973. After the Israeli victory in the Six-Day War, Israeli Jews began settling within the newly annexed territory, mainly that of the West Bank. These settlements, although completely illegal under international law, were sponsored by the Israeli government. Israeli Prime Minister Yigal Allon released the Allon Plan shortly after the Six-Day War. It was a map showing areas of the West Bank that would be returned to Jordan and areas that would be permanently annexed by Israel. Is this not an offensive action, PragerU? Seriously. Embarrassed from their resounding defeat to Israel in 1967, a peace treaty was not signed between Israel and Egypt or Syria or Jordan after the war. There were constant skirmishes between Egypt and Israel. Egypt and Syria were determined to regain the territory that had been lost in the Six-Day War. Egypt wanted the Sinai Peninsula back, while Syria wanted the Golan Heights back. Because of this, they ordered a surprise attack on Israel on Yom Kippur, a Jewish holy day, in 1973. As we've become accustomed to already, Israel's military was superior, but the war was prematurely stopped because it increased tensions between the U.S., who supported Israel, and the Soviet Union, who supported the Arab states. A ceasefire was agreed upon. Although Israel would maintain control of the Sinai Peninsula for a few years afterwards, it eventually gave it back to Egypt. In exchange, Egypt officially recognized Israel, and the two nations signed a peace treaty at the Camp David Accords in 1978. Unfortunately, Israel still has control of the Golan Heights, with President Trump even officially recognizing them as Israeli territory recently. This war, when viewed within a vacuum, is a clear act of aggression by Egypt and Syria, but when viewed with context, both nations invaded territory that rightly belonged to them. The view of Israel being defensive or offensive within the Yom Kippur War relies completely on if you believe its preemptive strike on Egypt in the Six-Day War was an act of aggression or was defensive. However, as I've been saying throughout this entire video, there are no certain truths when it comes to this conflict, but Harper and PragerU, in a dishonest way, portray them as such. Again, if those at PragerU were Arabic, and this is an honest question, Do you really think they'd have these same beliefs? Sometimes it's important to place yourself in the shoes of both sides of a conflict.
In between the wars, in between the terror, Israel has sought peace with its neighbors, and it has achieved peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. For others, however, every Israeli gesture for peace is met with incitement and violence. I recount this history for one reason. Any nation that has endured what Israel has endured could easily have become a police state. But through it all, Israel has never abandoned its commitment to the rule of law, to democracy, to tolerance. 1/5 of its citizens are Muslim. They enjoy the same rights as Jewish citizens. They occupy key positions in the nation's courts, press, and government, and they have their own parties representing them in the Knesset, Israel's parliament. To say that Muslims in Israel are the freest Muslims in the region is an understatement.
There are two things to unpack here. First is the claim that the Palestinians are unwilling to compromise and that their only goal is the destruction of Israel. The second is that the Israeli government is constantly coming to the table with realistic peace plans. Let's start with the first. In reality, Palestinians have come to the table to negotiate peace, but more importantly, negotiate in favor of an independent Palestinian state in what is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin came together at the White House in '93 to sign a peace deal, a deal which had the eventual creation of a Palestinian state as its main goal. The Accords gave us this map. Area A was to be under Palestinian control, Area B under shared control, while Area C was under Israeli control. This deal was viewed as a landmark, and many thought it would eventually lead to peace, but many within Israel, led on by the Likud party and its leader Benjamin Netanyahu, were vehemently against the Oslo Accords and the creation of a Palestinian state. These extremists made this much more than a political battle. They turned it into a religious war, where Jerusalem and the West Bank were granted to the Jewish people by God himself, and Rabin was the ultimate traitor because he wanted to give these lands to the enemy. The Oslo Accords fell through because of Rabin's assassination, a rise in Israeli extremism, and subsequent terrorist attacks committed by Palestinians, which gave the Likud party and Netanyahu the fuel they needed to flame the fires of war. Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an extremist member of the IDF named Yigal Amir. In the book Killing a King by Dan Ephron, a book I think everyone interested in this topic should read, Amir's extremism and how it was not just tolerated but encouraged by the IDF is detailed. Quote, Yigal was the enforcer with a capital E. Hit them hard, hit here, push there, destroy stuff. He enjoyed badgering them, Arabs, just for fun. The behavior drew mostly praise from Amir's officers. There were other forms of harassment as well. Amir told friends later that on patrols in Gaza, he and his buddies liked to drive their jeeps straight at oncoming Palestinian vehicles in order to provoke a response. If a driver didn't swerve to get out of their way, the soldiers would interpret the behavior as hostile and shoot at his windshield, unquote. Israelis such as Yigal Amir believed that any negotiation with the Palestinians was a betrayal of the Jewish people, and Netanyahu, who at the time was a leader in the opposition, had no problem with extremists such as Amir supporting the Likud party, often pandering to them. Let's go back to Killing a King. Ephron details this, writing, quote, For some 2 hours, Benjamin Netanyahu and a phalanx of other right-wing leaders stood on the balcony of the Ron Hotel above the square and watched as protesters came unhinged, burning pictures of the Prime Minister, chanting death to Rabin in a pulsating frenzy, unquote. Ephron continues, quote, On the balcony, Netanyahu seemed unfazed by the mayhem, even as protesters threw burning torches at the line of policemen. Any effort to call the crowd to order could well have turned the extremists against him, a risk Netanyahu evidently didn't want to take. Instead, he castigated Rabin for relying on the backing of Arab Israeli parliament members to get his agreement through parliament. Lawmakers had yet to vote on Oslo II, but it was clear by now that Rabin would need the representatives of Israel's Arab minority to support it in order for the deal to pass. Though Arab Israelis were full-fledged citizens and made up 1/6 of the population, Netanyahu and many other rightists were now arguing unblushingly that an endorsement that rested on the support of non-Jews would lack legitimacy. Quote, "The Jewish majority of the State of Israel has not approved the agreement," he said. "We will fight and we will bring down the government." Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by Amir shortly thereafter. Netanyahu was held by many Israelis, including his most recent election opponent, Benny Gantz, as having a role in the assassination of Rabin through incitement. After Rabin's murder, Shimon Peres became the acting PM, and an election was to be held a year later between Peres and Netanyahu for the next PM. Ephron states that this was essentially a, quote, referendum on the peace deals with the Palestinians. Would the West Bank and Gaza continue to be military-ruled enclaves where settlers strove to bring about the Jewish redemption, or would Israel cede them to the Palestinians? Unquote. Netanyahu won the resulting election, but it was a close one, with him receiving 50.5% and Peres 49.5%. However, this was the end of the Oslo Accords. With the Likud party and Netanyahu in power, plus an increase in attacks from Hamas and other Palestinian groups helping the rhetoric of Likud, it died a slow death. The main and only realistic route towards peace between the two people had been ended by Netanyahu. Here is a video of him describing how he did it.
הסכמי אוסלו שהכנסת חתמה עליהם, שאלו אותי לפני הבחירות, כן, בתנאי כפוף להדדיות וצמצום הנסיבות. אבל איך אתה מצמצם את הנסיבות? אני אתן פירוש להסכם שיאפשר לי להפסיק את הדהירה הזאת לקווי 67. איך עשינו את זה? אף אחד לא אמר מה זה אתרים צבאיים מוגדרים. אתרים צבאיים מוגדרים, אני אמרתי, אלה אזורי ביטחון. בקעת הירדן, מבחינתי זה אתר צבאי מוגדר.
PragerU's funny, right? They believe that this man who was unwilling to compromise, unwilling to support a two-state solution, and blatant anti-Arab racist, who has been Israel's leader since 2009, is pushing for peace. Netanyahu and the Likud party are anti-Arab racists. I mean, there's no question about this. In the lead-up to his re-election in 2015, Netanyahu stated that Arab votes are endangering the right-wing majority, and in his past has stated that any decision that doesn't have a Jewish majority is illegitimate.
שלטון הימין בסכנה. המצביעים הערבים מגיעים בכמויות אדירות לקלפי. עמותות השמאל מביאות אותם באוטובוסים. רבותיי, לנו אין V15. לנו יש צו 8, לנו יש רק אתכם.
In the 2019 Israeli elections, the party painted all Arabs as extremists and members of Hamas. Look at how a Likud member of parliament talks about Arabs when campaigning.
שאנחנו מזהים היום בסקרים שהשמאל יעשה את הכל כדי להפיל את הליכוד. מי שלא רוצה שמאל עם גוש חוסם של מפלגות ערביות חייב לבוא.
How is this election different from the past election?
הבחירות האלה שונות בזה שיש כאן המון פייק ניוז. לפיד גנץ, ממשלת שמאל שישבו יחד במפלגות ערביות, שמה שהמפלגות הערביות עושות, בראשם טיבי, זה לעודד טרור, לעודד שהידים, ולא לגנות פיגועים כנגד חפים.
Absolutely disgusting. I mean, there's no question that is vile behavior. In short, although Stephen Harper and PragerU state that Israel is a free and open state that guarantees all rights to the Arab minority, the Arabs are still a minority that live under the control of a right-wing government that doesn't view them as true Israeli citizens, but more as a possible threat whose true loyalties must always be questioned. Netanyahu stated multiple times, and his policies have proven that he is true to his word, that as long as he and Likud are in power, a Palestinian state will never be established. He wants to ensure this by annexing the Jewish settlements within the occupied West Bank during his current term as prime minister. This would be the final nail in the coffin of the two-state solution. Netanyahu's government has treated Palestinians criminally. The UN reported earlier this year that Israel may have committed war crimes in 2018 when the IDF killed 189 Palestinians who staged mass protests in Gaza. The rules of engagement were incredibly lax, with officials determining that those killed, quote, did not pose an immediate threat of death or serious injury to others when they were shot, unquote. Netanyahu's government responded by saying that these protesters were used as shields for Hamas, essentially stating, like PragerU, that all criticism of the Israeli government by Palestine is done so by radicals. PragerU pretends that none of this happened, stating that Benjamin Netanyahu, the most uncompromising Israeli leader, has made, quote, gestures for peace. Give me a break. But these have only been met by the uncompromising Palestinian leadership. And this is patently false. And yes, even though I am a leftist, I don't condone Hamas's rocket attacks. Yeah, truly shocking. They are criminal and target civilians, but importantly, have the opposite effect that they are intended to. These rockets allow radicals like Netanyahu to remain in power. But ironically, and something that PragerU would never mention, is that even radical crazy Hamas have changed their end goal from the destruction of Israel and the creation of a unified Arab state to a, quote, Palestinian state and territories occupied by Israel in the Six-Day War of 1967, unquote. This is a crazy concession, because you would think Hamas, crazy Hamas, would at least want the 1947 partition plan borders, but no. They are so willing to compromise that they are willing to have the 67 borders. What peace offers has Netanyahu made other than, it all belongs to Israel, by God, in the Torah, no questions asked? For real. PragerU conveniently leaves this out. The final fact that shows how the Israelis are now the side unwilling to compromise is the fact that Israel, with the help of the U.S., a member of the UN Security Council, will always block the creation of an independent Palestinian state. Even with the huge concessions that have been made on territory by Hamas, they will block it till the bitter end. The Oslo Accords were destroyed by Netanyahu and the Likud party, and now the two-state solution has been essentially destroyed by the same radicals. With Netanyahu in charge, I don't know how anyone can honestly believe that Israel are looking for a realistic compromise to this conflict.
How about this as a human rights test? Prisoners in Israel, be they Jewish or Arab, are well treated, well fed, and have access to the best possible medical care. Parents and spouses of these prisoners know where they are and that they are safe. Who else in the region but Israel can make that claim?
This is irrelevant to the discussion, PragerU. While the humane treatment of prisoners is a basic human right, one that most Arabic states, such as Saudi Arabia, don't honor, this statement is being used to distract us from the Israeli policies towards the West Bank and Gaza. When criticizing the U.S.'s policy of using Agent Orange and napalm during the Vietnam War, I don't care how the country treats its prisoners. I'm not discussing that policy. This has nothing to do with Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, or them killing 189 Palestinian protesters in 2019. As stated earlier, the U.S. and others don't support Israel because of how they treat their prisoners, just like the U.S. didn't support Kosovo Albanians because they were being genocided. If that was true, the U.S. would not be best friends with Saudi Arabia. In addition, Israel presently has a great relationship with Russia and Putin, who, as we know, don't have the best human rights record. Israel's treatment of its prisoners and its policies towards the West Bank and Gaza are two different discussions.
Through all the wars and all the terror, Israel has survived, and especially in the last 20 years, it has thrived. It's known as Startup Nation, and with good reason. Key components of your cell phone and your laptop were designed in Israel. A drug or a medical device that has saved your life or the life of a loved one may have been developed in Israel. Yet there are leftist politicians, activists, artists, academics, and college students who devote their lives to denouncing Israel, calling for boycotts, demanding it be cut off from academic and professional societies. Do they denounce the Palestinian leadership that hasn't held an election in well over a decade? Do they denounce the leadership of Hamas, who use women and children as human shields to protect their fighters. No, they denounce free, vibrant, democratic, innovative Israel.
This is a classic straw man. Really, PragerU, no one on the left denounces the leadership of Palestine and Hamas? Oh my god. I've done it multiple times just in this video. This is a common tactic used to shut down criticism of Israeli policy, and one that has thoroughly poisoned this debate within the US. Let's take the Palestinian protests in Gaza last year, where 189 people died. If you don't support Israel's aggressive actions against the protesters, then PragerU, Fox, and many Democrats will brand you as defenders of Hamas and those that supposedly want to see the destruction of Israel. If you've gotten this far into the video, you know that I am clearly not a fan of Hamas, the PLO, or Ephron, but I believe in the right of Palestinians to protest the occupation of their lands. Ilhan Omar was also accused of only criticizing Israel while remaining silent about Saudi Arabia and other repressive Middle Eastern regimes. But again, this is untrue. PragerU knows that it's possible to criticize both Hamas and the policies of the Israeli government, but chooses to brand all protesters and supporters of the protesters as Hamas defenders. Truly dishonest and disgusting tactics. In addition, it's important to understand that PragerU and Harper are using Israel's innovative and groundbreaking economy as a shield of its crimes and occupation and treatment of those in the West Bank and Gaza. Nazi Germany was also incredibly innovative, building the first highways and developing the first jet planes. But only apologists of that horrible regime bring these things up as positives. Now, of course, before you start typing in the comments, I'm not comparing the current Israeli government to Nazi Germany. But just like the map propaganda, this is a tactic used to act as a shield and divert your attention from the crimes that Israel is currently committing.
With all the brutal and violent regimes, not only in the Middle East, but around the world, how is one to explain singling out Israel for condemnation? Sadly, only one explanation fits: anti-Semitism. Do these haters of Israel question the legitimacy of any other democratic nation, of any nation for that matter? Of course, the answer is no. Somehow they only manage to oppose the Jewish one. The State of Israel has now existed for 70 years. It is one of the freest, most prosperous, most successful nations on earth. Why do I support Israel? Why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't anyone?
PragerU always accuses leftists of questioning the legitimacy of the US, Canada, and other nations that were once inhabited by native peoples and conquered by European colonialists. But now, when it fits their agenda, they strawman the left in a different way. Of course, the answer is no. Oh my god. I have to laugh. There's no other way to do it. The left questions, and myself question, the legitimacy of almost every state, because the idea of a nation state is relatively new and requires such questioning. But apparently the left only questions Israel. Jesus Christ, man. I thought labeling a point of view as racist, bigoted, or Islamophobic, or transphobic, or homophobic was a tactic by the left of shutting down debate. Apparently not when it comes to Israel. Man, the hypocrisy of these guys at PragerU is truly staggering. In conclusion, I want you to think shortly about how the right-wingers at PragerU, Fox, and the Republican Party would respond to this entire conflict if they were Palestinian. Would they have welcomed in the hundreds of thousands of European Jews onto their land? Would they have been against the Arab states attempting to stop the creation of Israel in 1948 via military means? Would they have vehemently opposed Israel offensively invading Egypt over the Suez Canal? Would they have supported Israel's offensive strike against Egypt and its subsequent annexation of the West Bank, Gaza, Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights? Finally, would they have supported the Yom Kippur War to retake these annexed lands? Even the PragerU fans watching right now know the answers to these questions. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's quite long, but if you've made it this far, thank you very much to watching the entire thing. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like. I worked very hard on this video. It took over a month of planning and creating and writing and editing. So please share it on Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you can. And of course, if you're new, hit that subscribe button. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comment section if I should do more of these long form videos. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.